Welcome, everybody. We're gonna get started. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited. My name is Kevin Witt. I am the Director of Growing Spiritual Transformational Leaders for the Susquehanna Conference of the United Methodist Church. And it is thrilling to have Todd Bolsinger with us tonight. He is an author of several very inspiring books that have been deeply formative for those of us who are Christian leaders, especially during these times of great change. And during times of great change, one of the most important things is to stay deeply connected with God. So let's begin with prayer. Please join me. God, we thank you for this opportunity to be together with Todd. We thank you for his deep commitment to Christ, his love, his willingness to share his insights with us, and his presence with us. We pray your blessings upon this time together, that all of us may receive inspiration that will help us to be more fruitful as leaders, more centered as leaders, and more excited to be a part of this journey with you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We'd really like this to be a dialogue, not only between Todd and I, but also a dialogue in which you can participate. And the way that you can participate is to submit any questions that you have for Todd in the Q&A. And we will get to the Q&A and respond to as many of those questions as we can today. I want to say hello to you, Todd, and tell you how grateful we are that you're willing to be here with us for this really important conversation. So welcome, and our deepest gratitude.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the invitation. It's nice to be with you.
Great. One of the things that I wanted to explore with you, Todd, is in your earlier book, Canoeing the Mountains, which, by the way, was an amazing book for me. I learned so much from it. In that book, you were helping us as leaders to try to figure out, how can we help our congregations? How can we help our faith communities thrive when so much was changing in the environment in which they were living, in the external environment? And so I thought, well, when I read Tempered Resilience, I'm probably going to get some more information about that. And what I discovered is Tempered Resilience is a completely different book. It's really about, instead of the exterior landscape, it's the interior landscape of the leader, her or himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so would you talk to us a little bit about why what goes on inside of us is just as important as what's happening around us?
Yeah.
And why you chose the metaphor of a forge to talk about resilient leadership?
Yeah, so I appreciate this. So for about 5 years, I traveled around the country talking about on the themes of Canoeing the Mountains. It's all about the way in which we need to learn to lead change when we can't rely on our past expertise, when the circumstances have changed so dramatically that we are now literally in uncharted territory. And what I found very often, it happened so often that it became almost like comical to me, is that the very kind people who invited me, it'd be like you and Kim, would usually take me to lunch before they put me on the plane. And then I would get this thing would happen almost every time. It would be, hey, we really want to get your slides. I said, sure. And, can anybody do this? And at first I was like, whoa, I must not have done a very good job training. And then I heard it differently. They said, it was a United Methodist district superintendent who said to me, I wonder if we have anybody in our district who has the stomach for this. This is hard. And yeah, that is actually what I began to recognize, is how difficult adaptive change was. And what made it difficult wasn't the external challenges. Those are hard. What made it really difficult was when you went to your own people and asked them to take on the challenge of changing for the sake of the mission of God in your area, in your neighborhood. And they would say, no. I mean, most of the time they wouldn't say no directly. They would just, they would get resistant. And all of a sudden I realized that was the soul sucking thing. It wasn't the external challenges. It was the internal resistance of our own people. and that what part of it needed was that required a kind of resilience in a leader, a kind of, I call it tempered resilience, because it's not just strength, it's strength and wisdom, it's flexibility and courage. It's a combination of the capacity to bring transformation that is really hard. And so tempered resilience really became about the way in which I could help people think through the formation needed for leaders to develop the kind of resilience to face internal resistance. So it's a formation book is what it is. And it's built on that notion of how do you become a tempered tool that can bring transformation?
It's so true. I think that almost all of us would echo that this is probably the most challenging time that I've ever been a part of in my entire ministry.
Yeah.
It's truly challenging. What I find helpful in your book is that you talk about some very specific processes help us become resilient so that we can lead in these kind of challenging, very difficult times. Would you give us an overview of elements of that process so that all of us can get up to speed on what's involved and the different key aspects of this whole resilient leadership?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. So the metaphor that I use in the book, was inspired by a time when I was actually in Washington, D.C., and I was at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, and I saw this section of the "I Have a Dream" speech that I'd studied in college, that they have like carved in one of the monument, and it's literally this phrase: "With this faith, we will be able to hew out of a mountain of despair stones of hope." With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of a mountain of despair stones of hope. And so I went back and I studied that speech again. And it's really interesting, so the "I Have a Dream" section wasn't in the original speech. Dr. King had been up till 4 a.m. with Clarence B. Jones preparing a speech for this March on Washington. 250,000 people gathered. And they were gathered there in front of him, and he was the keynote at the end of the day of a lot of speeches. And Mahalia Jackson had already sang and done a couple of gospels and songs and hymns. And he gets up to speak, and he prepared a speech that was built on a metaphor of the United States giving a bad check to its African-American citizens. 100 years after the Civil War, they had given promises, like a promissory note that had been returned to insufficient funds. And it was time for the African-American citizens of this country to get the rights due to it that had been promised, and that it was time to make good on the promissory note. And what happened is, in the speech, they report later that what happened is that he had hit a line and it didn't have the effect. And if you've ever had that experience as a preacher, you know what it's like. We're like, oh, wait a minute, they were supposed to laugh, or they were supposed to cry, or they were supposed to at least notice. And he pauses, and Mahalia Jackson yells at him, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." She had heard him do the "I Have a Dream" section in Detroit and then a couple of other places. And so he slides his notes to the side, and Clarence B. Jones turns to the guy next to him and says, "These people don't know, but they're about to go to church." and he launches into Isaiah 40. And in Isaiah 40, it talks about the fact that the mountains will be made low, and that the rough places will be made a plain, and a river will run through it, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh shall see it. And he says, with this faith that God is going to redeem all of creation, we go back to the South. You pause on that. He's saying to a bunch of people who'd come from the South, right? Who'd come from the marches and the protests and the dogs and the hoses and the jails. He says, because God is going to reconcile the whole world, we go back to the struggle. We go back to the struggle. It's a 400-year-old struggle, right?
Yeah.
With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of a mountain of despair stones of hope. We will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. And that's just great parallelism, right? Any of us who preach know that, right? 2 sentences to make 1 point. He connects hewing to transformation. And all of a sudden the metaphor becomes really clear, right? What do you do when you're staring at a mountain of despair, like a 400-year, like a granite rock? You don't bash it like a sledgehammer. You don't blow it up. like with dynamite. You don't back down, you hew it, you transform it, you turn it into stones of hope. And every time when I read that first time, I was thinking, it's like First Peter, right? Come to him a living stone and let yourself as living stones be built into a dwelling place for God, the place where God's
Yes.
presence would be known. So what that led me to, I just love that part of history, but what it led me to is to start thinking about, what does it take to become a tool that can hew? And that's a tempered tool. That's a tool that is both strong and flexible. It has the strength to confront the rock, but it has the flexibility to cut through it rather than bash it. And so I thought about the way in which tempered tools are made, and I ended up taking a blacksmithing class.
Wow.
So my wife and I took a blacksmithing class in Los Angeles. There is an urban blacksmithing community in LA, in a neighborhood that has not had a horse there in 100 years, but there are a bunch of blacksmiths. And so they'll literally teach you how to blacksmith. And so I took a blacksmithing class. And in the middle of the class, I began to realize there's a process of transforming steel into a tool that feels really similar to me to the process that we have to go through as leaders. And so it's got these steps to it. And I've got a slide if you want. I can kind of just walk
That'd be
through the
great.
steps if
That'd
that
be
would be
great.
helpful, right? So let me just pull this up. It happens to be in one of my presentations that I can just pull up here. So oh, that's not it. Let me go here. Let me go here. So here, I should do it. Yeah, here we go. So this is the process that we go through. So it starts with the notion of this. When you walk into a blacksmithing class and you walk into a blacksmithing shop, you realize that you cannot learn this in a book. Like the same way that the steel is immediately put into the fire, you're put in the class immediately in front of a forge. And I remember the time they gave me ear protection. That's all they gave me, was just this ear protection. I kept thinking I was going to have like chain mail or something, right? And they hand you a tong and a steel piece of steel, and you put it into the fire, and you're blacksmithing. You're being transformed into a blacksmith. The steel is being transformed into a tool. You're in it. And while it's sitting there heating, they literally start telling you stuff like, oh, by the way, sign this piece of paper because you could get hurt doing this. And this could be dangerous to you. And I thought, this is what it's like to lead. You're in it before you know it, right?
Absolutely.
You're in it before you know it. And what I started realizing when I talked to leaders around the country, this was one of the first parts that made leadership so difficult, especially when you're in a situation where you just can't manage the results, but you're actually leading change. It's that your leaders are formed in the leading. You're formed in the middle of the process. Remember that the moment you become a leader is right after you were in success at something that was not leading.
Okay.
Right. So you're the best preacher and they make you the pastor. There's a big difference between giving a good sermon and leading a congregation, right?
Yeah, good point.
Or you're right. You're the best salesperson. They make you the sales manager, or you're like the best. I work at a seminary, right? So, the last time we hired a dean, they said they have a 20-page CV. They've been publishing for years. And I'm thinking they've been in a library by themselves. Why do we think they're going to be any good at dealing with people, let alone like the kind of, nerds that a bunch of faculty members are like, so. But that's what happens. You go from being an expert to having to lead the learning. And it's like you're thrown into the fire. And so the heating is the next part. And this is one of the interesting parts about steel and about leadership, is that strength is actually forged in vulnerable self-reflection. In the blacksmithing class, they had this moment where they told us to reach in and pull out the steel. And when we pulled it out, the guy says, hey, okay, look, it looks the same as it did 5 minutes ago. Don't touch it. It's 700 degrees. It'll burn the skin off your hands, but it's not yet ready to forge. You can't do anything with it yet. If you strike it or twist it or turn it, you'll just mar it and scar it. You got to throw it back in the fire until it's at 2000 degrees.
Wow.
Till it turns orange and almost liquid. And really, this is for me is, I mean, I was talking today, I do a bunch of executive coaching. I'm talking to one of my clients today.
Mhm.
And I said, the transformation's only going to happen when you allow yourself to feel the vulnerability of standing in front of a group of people who need to be transformed, and the vulnerability that you acknowledge your own need to be transformed. And this is really hard because most of us were
Mhm.
told that leadership is about putting on a good front, like looking
Mhm.
good. It's being
Mhm.
700 degrees, right? And a 700-degree piece of steel can harm you, it can hurt you, but you can't form it into anything. And that's where a lot of us, I think, as leaders end up. So the process then of working and heating, and then we talk about holding, like that's the work of the
Mhm.
anvil.
Mhm.
Once you finally get it hot enough, you got to put it on the anvil. And the kind of relationships we need, the thick, heavy relationships. I mean, we can talk
Mhm.
about that in more depth. It's right the center of what we
Mhm.
talk about. The hammering that literally shapes the tool and also strengthens it, the hewing, the way you use the tool, and ultimately the tempering, which is the tool becomes tempered as it is slowly cooled. It's called quenching in
Mhm.
blacksmith terms. It's slowly cooled. It's not plunged into water,
Mhm.
because if you do that, it just locks in the stress. It actually slowly cools it. And in that slow cooling, it releases appropriate amount of stress. And so you end up with steel that is both stronger and more flexible than it
Mhm.
was before. And it becomes a perfect tempered tool. So the book really talks about a process of formation that happens in our own lives that we need to think about along the way. So that's where that came from.
Well, I found the image really powerful, Todd, and one of the pieces that I'd like to explore a little bit more deeply is the idea of the anvil that holds
Yeah.
the steel so it doesn't just go all over the place and just doesn't dissolve
Yeah.
on. When I was reading that, it was talking about every spiritual leader needs to have relationships that are secure.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, you're going to spill off. You're not going to be held in the way that you need to be held. And so I'm very curious because the truth is, a lot of times it's really lonely.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is. And
Yeah.
it's hard to come up with the energy when you're in the midst of change. And like you said, there's always going to be resistance. The idea that change is just going to flow and it's all going to just work out fine. That's not how I experience life. So,
No.
so talk to me about
Yeah.
what kind of relationships do you mean?
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
do I find them?
Hmm.
How do I nurture them?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you think about this, like your setup when you go into a blacksmithing shop and you start blacksmithing, the way you know where you're going to be is that you are in front of the forge that is just blazing, but they put you in front of an anvil. They actually gave me an anvil and let me put my name on it. I get to use this anvil. This anvil is thick, it's heavy. And the reason why is because all of the shaping happens on the anvil,
Mm,
right? So you don't take out a piece of steel, it's not in, and have it all, oozy and molten and ready to shape, and then, do it in midair or walk it
mm,
around the shop. They go, look, the only safe place for something this hot is on an anvil. And for leaders, and when I coach and we do stuff, we talk about the fact that leadership is going to make you feel vulnerable. It's
mhm,
especially when you've got to lead people in adaptive leadership, which
mhm,
starts with, like, I'm not an expert, I don't know, we're going
mhm,
to learn as we go, we're going to experiment as we go, we're going to
mhm,
have to listen to voices we haven't listened to before, we're going to have to try things we haven't tried before.
mhm,
It feels vulnerable, right? It just has that feel
mhm,
to it. And what you end up with is this anvil is a great metaphor for how much security we need,
mm,
and how ironic it is that most of us as leaders feel like we have, that we're not allowed to invest in the kind of relationships.
mm,
So in the book, I talk about, you need, basically there's three categories of leaders. You need partners, you need
mhm,
mentors, and you need friends, and you
mm,
need all three.
mm.
And the way you know the difference is, I would say partners are the people who care about the mission as much as I do. They're
Okay.
the ones that if I stray from the mission, they're going to come knocking on my door. They're going to be the ones saying, hey, we signed up to be part of this thing with you. We came to this church because you talked about reaching our neighborhood. We got committed to this vision. Like what's the problem, right?
Yeah.
Partners are people who care about the mission as much as you do. Your friends are people who care about, I would say my friends are people who care about me more than they care about the mission.
Okay.
Right? They're the people in my life. Like I would say, my friends are the people who say to me stuff like, hey, Todd, we saw that you got a new book out. I go, I know. You want to read it? And they go, no. like, I don't read that. I read like detective novels. I read business books. I'm not interested. Like my friends are not interested in the mission. They might be part of our church, but their first loyalty is to you as a person. In the book, I tell a story about one of my good friends. He was part of our church. His family was all part of the church. And I kept asking him if he would want to be on our session. I was a Presbyterian, that's our board. And he would say no every time. And finally I looked at him, I said, why? He goes, because I know that a good board member needs to hold you accountable and needs to care about the church. And I actually care about you more than I care about the church. And at first I was really disappointed. I thought like, I got to do a better job of discipling him. And I realized what he was doing was he was really mature. He loved Jesus, but he knew that his loyalty was to me. And a huge mistake we often make is putting our friends on the board. And what we realize is it hurts the mission. So the partners care about the mission. Your friends care about me. And mentors are people who care about me for the sake of the mission. So the mentors are our coaches, our spiritual directors, our therapists. You know, the mentors are the people who invest in our lives for the sake of the mission. And that's really where that's my work these days. My work is on coaching and consulting and speaking and writing to help leaders be more faithful to their mission, but also for them to thrive as people. So I care deeply about them as individuals, but I also think to myself, you know, they have a church that God has entrusted to them, and my job is to help them be faithful to that mission. So when you start thinking about this, you start realizing how thick the relationships need. And I always encourage leaders, like, do an inventory, right? Who are your partners? Or do you really feel like you're alone? Like nobody else cares about this as much as you do? Who are your friends? Or do you end up feeling alone? Like everybody wants something from me and nobody cares about me. And then who are your mentors? And if I could just say one little last word about this, I know I'm talking to Methodists here, and I'm not Methodist, but I've actually said this before in front of a Methodist bishop. And it was a little bit embarrassing because they laughed at me, but I said, if I was a bishop, and if I had the ability to say, look, anybody in my annual conference, if you try to lead anything without a spiritual director, a coach, or a therapist, I'm going to consider that leadership malpractice. Because I learned that from my wife. She was a marriage and family therapist before she became an executive coach. And she once came home after being in our presbytery. She was part of our clergy sexual misconduct task force. And so she was a person picking up the pieces with a woman was a victim because some pastor could not manage the boundaries appropriately. And she was hurt. And she came home mad and she said, look, I don't get it. As a marriage and family therapist in the state of California, if I don't have supervision and I make a mistake, I am held more liable. I have 15 clients and I have supervision. You have 1,500 members and nobody ever asks you anything. So I really believe that one of the things you need, if you're going to actually be able to transform, lead appropriately, go through resistance, help people go through the process of transformation, is you need to have an anvil of relationships that hold you. The idea of a solo pastor is just an unbiblical idea.
Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the scriptural stories that illustrate this as an example of somebody who's responsive to an anvil that can be supported to them?
Yeah. So one of the parts that's so powerful about this is when you start, like, one of the parts I just start off right at the bat is when I was writing about Lewis and Clark, right? The story of Canoeing the Mountains, which is just, it's a historical story that is fraught. It's complicated. It's like a biblical story, right? So somebody said, you know, biblical stories are not models we emulate. They're mirrors we identify with. They're very human. Well, Lewis and Clark is very human, and for all of the stuff that is inspiring, there's all kinds of attendant issues that are related, like in our own American history. But one of the parts that was amazing about them is that they're known as Lewis and Clark, like one word. Like you can be in like, Lewiston, Idaho, and not know it was named after Meriwether Lewis, or you can be in Clark County, Kentucky, like I was, and give this presentation and not know that it was named after William Clark. But what you start realizing is they had this kind of partnership. They literally said they were partners in every way. It's this amazing story. They had to literally violate Thomas Jefferson and the Congress's orders to be partners, because they wanted them to be in a traditional hierarchy of line of authority. And they said, no, we're going to be partners. And when people say, well, that won't work in a church, and we go, you mean like Paul and Silas, or Barnabas and Paul, or Aquila and Priscilla, or like there's this partnership in the middle of it, and there's this depth of relationship, and you see Jesus, who literally has partners and friends with him, the 12, the 3, like you start recognizing that we have this model of the sole leader that is so profoundly different than the rest of the scriptures all the way through. I mean, Moses has Miriam and Aaron. And in the Jewish Midrash, it's really interesting. There's this Jonathan Sachs, who is the chief rabbi of London, did a commentary on the Torah, thinking about leadership. And he talks about the fact that when Moses loses his cool, he gets so angry at the Israelites that God says he will not go into the promised land.
Yeah.
It's right after he loses Miriam. Miriam dies.
Oh, yeah.
And he loses his sister. You know that Aaron was his partner, but you kind of wonder if Miriam was actually his friend who loved him and cared for him. He loses his sister, and then he loses his cool. And we just have to recognize that there's all this deep relational need that we have, that if we're going to lead well, we've got to be in those kind of relationships.
Yeah. Thank you, Todd. And this, Kim, I know that I didn't talk to you about this earlier, but since Todd has brought this up, I think it's really important. Would you share a little bit about the coaches that are available?
Oh, good.
There's in our conference.
Gladly. I was hoping I'd get a commercial about that. We've developed a coaching network of people that have been trained and available to service our local congregations and pastors for whatever kind of transformative work they want to do. Or it's individual for a pastor's leadership capacity, or a church that's working through a transformative process. We have folks that are trained to walk alongside and help you to realize the goals that you set for yourselves. And right now we have about 20, 25 active coaches that are available for throughout the conference.
Yeah.
It is pretty exciting work.
Thank you, Kim. I just wanted people on the webinar to realize that there are options, because sometimes you feel like, well, I can't afford a coach, or there's no coaches available in my area. And I didn't want people leaving the webinar without knowing that, you do have options related to the coaching part.
And I'm the manager of that site, so contact me, kshockley@susumc.org.
Great. Awesome. Todd, the other thing that kind of captured my imagination when I was reading the book, turning to a different aspect, is under hammering, you talk about stress is what creates a leader. And that's counterintuitive to some of what we're told. In other words, we're told there's too much stress in your life. You need to reduce the stress, or it's really unhealthy. We are learning things like non-anxious leadership, so we're not taking on other people's stress. And then I read in your book, no, stress is necessary to the formation of a leader. Yeah. And I'm asking myself, Todd, what are you talking about? How do you stay healthy? And what does that mean? Can you talk to us more about that?
Yeah. So after I took two of the blacksmithing classes at this in this blacksmithing community, I looked up online the person who runs it. She's a woman blacksmith who's an artist, And I asked if I could go visit her and come and interview her, and I did. And she was really gracious. She's amazing. And she took me to her shop, and it's outdoor shop in Los Angeles. And she took me, she's got all these forges and all these tools. It was really amazing. And she sat down with me and we talked about the process of blacksmithing. And here's one of the most interesting parts. So if you got a piece of steel and you heat it up and you start pounding it into shape, you hammer it into shape, you're doing two things when you hammer it. You hammer it into shape, and you hammer it so that the molecules compress and it gets stronger. So you're actually adding stress to the steel. And the whole point is the hammering process is what creates it. And so in the book, I talk about the idea of spiritual practices as being like hammers that both shape us and strengthen us. That for many of us, we think of our spiritual practices as all being stress relieving, and there's a place for that in the model, and a really important place. But part of what spiritual practices do is they actually shape us and strengthen us. They create the amount of appropriate stress. And you see this by, if any of you are familiar with, say, St. Ignatius's spiritual exercises. St. Ignatius believed that you needed moderate stress. That's actually the phrase he used. He said you need a moderate amount of stress, because what the stress does is it actually makes us stronger. And so think about the notion of spiritual practices as having as the way in which we are shaped. So one of the things I encourage people to do when I'm coaching and when we're working with people is I have them reflect on their spiritual practices. And most of us took on spiritual practices at a time in our life where they were stressful in the right way. They helped us grow, right? So when I was a 17-year-old and I gave my life to Christ, somebody said to me, like, you need to read the Bible every day. You need to develop a discipline of prayer. You need to go to church every week. Well, I'm a 17-year-old and I now got to go to church every week and I got to read the Bible every day. Well, that's part of how I grew.
Okay.
Right? You grow because you take on these practices. And so then when I became a preacher, when I became a pastor, I couldn't just read the Bible every day. Like I needed to read hours of scripture.
Yes.
Right? I needed to read hours of scripture, deep theological, deep exegetical work, so that I could preach well. It strengthened my ability to not only know the scriptures, but hold them well. My prayer life took on when you start praying for a congregation, you start praying for people in the congregation, your prayer life takes on a different tone. And so one of the questions I always ask people is, so as you've started leading, especially if you started leading change, what spiritual practices have you taken on? Are your practices the kind of practices that help create the characteristics of resilience that you need? So like, for example, one of the spiritual practices that is needed, one of the characteristics needed to be able to lead change well, is you have to be able to have the humility to keep learning, that vulnerability, that humility. And in the scriptures, it's really interesting because the scriptures and organizational leadership literature is really clear on this. It's not self-effacing humility. It's humility to learn. It's teachability. It's having a beginner's mind. It's being open to learning, being open to correction, being open to trying some things and failing. Well, some of us need to just practice that more and have practices of learning. Or one more that I'll mention. I mean, in the book, I talk about listening, learning, looking, and lamenting as ways of developing teachability, attunement, adaptability, and tenacity. And attunement's a really important one. Many of us as pastors have developed the empathy to do pastoral care, but we've never figured out the way in which empathy actually helps us to lead. Because when you empathize with people, that we now know from brain science that the brains start to attune to each other. People start to trust you and will go with you on a journey, even if cognitively they're not sure they believe in it yet. So attunement accelerates change. Well, you can't just do that by wanting to do it. Right? That's why we do CPE. That's why we do marriage and family care counseling. This is why we should be in counseling. This is why we practice listening skills, right? That is stress. That's the right, appropriate, moderate stress. And so what you're talking about is trying to take on the right kind of stress that will help you to grow. The hard part, of course, about this, and this is the last piece about stress about this, is that when the tool is shaped, once you start using the tool, you're hammering into the rock. that same hammering keeps adding more stress to the tool.
Mm.
And so the blacksmith, Heather McClartney, said to me, look, here's the thing you need to know. I can use this tool and keep hammering with it until I break it.
Mm.
So you also need to be able to get the stress out of the tool. And that's what a tempering is. It's adding stress and taking it out.
Mm.
And that's why leaders have to have a rhythm of leading and working and growing and not leading and resting and recreating it. I mean, this is for me, this is why I spend time outside. It's why I have time with my family. It's why I spend after a week of doing adaptive change with people, I spend the weekends cooking because I don't have to do any transformation. I just get to do really technical tasks that make people really happy. Like, right,
Yeah.
right? And so it's that rhythm. And so stress and managing stress and managing appropriate stress is a really important part to growing as a leader. So it's a pretty long answer, but.
Well, what came to my mind when you were talking about that is the fruit of the spirit, right?
Mm.
Talking about empathy, patience, kindness, peace, peacefulness, love.
Yeah.
They are the fruit of the spirit, not the fruit of our own creation.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I hear you saying is, can you open yourself? Can I open myself to time with God so that I can be shaped?
Yeah. Yeah.
Lifelong learning that you're talking about. So yeah, there is a little bit of pressure in the sense that I'm going to be reformed, but I don't feel like it's not a destructive kind of pressure.
Yeah, it's and again, the way when when I think about moderate, I'm not trying to say, oh, we got to balance it, like, oh, only do a little bit. I'm saying there's times when it's intense, right? Jesus sweat blood, right? Like Paul was shipwrecked, right? It's like, right? But there's a rhythm of leading and not leading. There's a pattern of being able to enter in and take responsibility and also let go and not. There's, Jesus who does miracles and then gets away from the crowd to go up by himself to pray, right? There's this rhythm that needs to be part of our lives. And that appropriate rhythm, I think, is what keeps us going. And for many of us, the reason why we end up overstressed is not just because we're working so hard. It's because we have a need to work this hard to get approval or to be a success or to whatever. We are haunted by something that is not the work of the Spirit of God. It's oftentimes a different voice. And that includes our congregations, who demand too much of us. And we're like, we are so afraid of disappointing them or of acknowledging our human need. I remember 3 years into being a senior pastor, my wife said to me, look, you cannot be out every night of the week being super pastor and expect to have a good marriage and be a good dad. You're going to have to sit down with the session. And this is why when I talk about spiritual practices, I talk about them as a rule of life.
Yes.
There were some rules we needed in our lives. I needed to say, there's only so many nights I can be out. There was my wife and I had a date night every single week for years. We couldn't afford a babysitter.
Yeah.
Thank God we had this older couple in the church who loved our kids. And most of the time we couldn't afford dinner or anything. We would just go get like frozen yogurt and watch and say, okay, we're not going back until she puts our daughter to bed because we do not want to fight tonight. Like we won't fight. Like we would fight over putting our daughter to bed. Like somebody else put her to bed one night a week so that we didn't have to argue about it. Like that notion of having that rhythm of life is really critical to leaders.
Well, one of the things that I think, at least in my life, I was taught that being a responsible leader means that I don't shirk times that leadership is needed. Yeah. And what I hear you saying is, oh, whoa, that's not the only definition of faithful leader.
Yeah. In adaptive leadership, Ronald Heifetz has this great phrase. He says that you have to be able to give the work back to the people that are most affected by it. So a ton of what a leader does is creates the environment for others to step in. We see this in Acts chapter 6, right? The widows, the Greek widows are not being served. And so they go ask the Greek people, the Gentiles, to make sure they get served. And they say, we will attend to the word, there's all kinds of conversations these days about that. Attending to the word was not just teaching, it meant preaching and doing the mission of God. Like like there's a sense that we are going to have to be in this together. We see this in Moses's life, right? You know, the whole go to Jethro, and Jethro says, you're trying to do it all yourself, right? So there's this pattern of shared ministry that is critical in leading change, and including giving it back to the people most affected.
Yeah, thank you. That's really powerful. Kim, I want to open up this dialogue so that those who are attending can also be part of the dialogue. Are there any questions that have arisen?
Yes, we have 3 questions. The first one came from the section where you were talking about relationships. And Tina wants to know, what about if they care about the building more than the mission?
Oh gosh, isn't that the case? I mean, yeah. So I think one of the parts that we're grappling with in COVID is, I got to be careful about this. I did a building project. I did a 10-year building project. I really think there's something really profound about building projects. But now we start realizing that Winston Churchill said, you know, you build your buildings and then your buildings build you. And I think some of us are really caught in this. We have come to recognize that when people think of the church, they now think of the church as the location. We can't imagine ministry anywhere but in this campus, or worship in any place but with this organ, or like we have created a mental model of the church that is dependent on a location and a facility that literally you don't find anywhere in the scriptures. So I'm not saying that we should get rid of all of our buildings. I think we need to think about our buildings more and more. I think about our buildings the way I think the earlier generations used to think about church buses. Like the church bus is a really, really good idea. But today I know a lot of really big churches that got rid of all their buses because it'd be really better to just carpool. And I think that we should think about our buildings as a tool that God has given us for good stewardship. And especially when you think about the number of buildings that were built in the 60s that were built to model churches, schools with classrooms, where today discipleship probably takes place in backyards better than classrooms, in living rooms, like now with technology. So I do think we have, there's a systems issue, theory that goes like this: today's problems are built on yesterday's successes. And I think that for those of us in the main line, especially, you know, Methodist, Presbyterians and stuff, who did really, really a lot of building, I think now today we're struggling with that notion. In one statistic I saw yesterday was that 40% of the churches built in Europe have now been converted into some other use. 40%. And in our denomination, they're having conversations about expecting that there might be as many as a third of our churches that may not be able to come back from COVID because they're just overwhelmed with the churches have shrunk and they're overwhelmed with the attendant maintenance and all that. So I think this is going to be a season of rethinking the idea of you might have to drop the canoes to get going. Well, some of those canoes might be beautiful buildings that need to be repurposed.
Especially if people can't connect the building to the usefulness of the mission.
Man. Yeah, I think the future, I've said that, you know, so interesting that we're sitting here on Zoom. Okay. I did not do one Zoom webinar before March 15th last year. I've done 105 since then. Now the question I'm going to be asking myself is, how many times am I going to get on a plane in the future? And right, like when you think about, I'm sure I'm going to gather face to face. I'm sure I'm going to be flying. I've already got some people who have asked me to come, but I did way more speaking to way more people because of webinars than I did face to face. So I think it's going to be a combination. It's going to be high tech and high touch, and we're going to have to rethink the way in which we do a bunch of stuff. So we could talk about this one a lot.
Yeah, right. Well, I have another question that's kind of related to the whole COVID situation. Seen, for good or bad, the effects of a year of semi-isolation, concepts of partner, mentor, and friend.
Yeah. Well, my spiritual director said that she believed that COVID was for me a forced sabbatical. so she knows something about my soul and my rhythm. She said, you know, she goes, and so since it was a forced sabbatical, you're going to chafe against it. But sabbaticals do what Sabbaths do. They make you confront your power. They make you confront your idols. They make you grapple with what you need to release and let go of. And so one of the parts I think that's going to come out of COVID, I get vaccinated for the first time next week, and 3 weeks later, I'm going to get another one, and I'm going to go hug my kids. Like, I miss the heck out of them. Right. And I got friends that I haven't been able to be with. And I've been working in this little bedroom for a year. There's a lot of things that are going to be great when that happens, but there's a bunch of parts of things that I learned this year that I got to figure out wisely how to take into this world.
Mhm.
And one of them is really rethinking the way that we stay connected over distance.
Right. Right. Thank you.
That's great.
So I had a question about, actually 2 questions about moderate stress. People are really engaged around that idea.
Yeah.
One is the difficulties Paul faced were hardly moderate stress. You mentioned the shipwreck. Did they make him stronger?
Yeah. So when Paul says, your grace is sufficient for me, I think what Paul experienced is what it's like to be emptied out and poured out. And there are moments that we do, right? Like, I want to be careful about this. I'm not saying that Christian ministry should always be comfortable. I mean, martyrdom is witness. So let's be clear about that. A ton, however, of what we take on isn't about that. Like, I have a mentor in my life who believes that he has been really significant in my life. And he has said, he believes that most pastors struggle mostly from a desire to be loved and accepted and approved. Their need for approval is what drives them more than the work of the Spirit of God. And that's been a really real challenge to me. I mean, I think, so when we talk about taking on the things that, like, laying down our lives for the sake of the gospel, it might not feel like moderate stress, but for St. Ignatius, there was a difference between doing the things you do by the power of the Spirit and obedience to God, and the things that we do because we take them on out of our own ego needs or insecurities. And so this is why when I talk about this, what I want to be really careful about is this notion that to be a person who's leading change is really hard. You need to develop tempered resilience, requires you to be in a constant formation process, including a rhythm of leading and not leading, including a letting go, a letting down. Right.
One of the things that you talked about, and you may have another question, so we'll come back to that question, but this is related to what Todd is saying. The whole idea that we do many things to please other people and to make sure that they're happy, I feel that a lot. And it has an impact on my heart at one level. And it has an impact on I'm nervous about doing certain things because I think I might break a relationship, or and I want to maintain that relationship. And so can you talk to us a little bit about resilient leadership in relationship to nerve and heart?
Yeah. So Edmund Friedman, if you're familiar with his work, he's kind of like the systems thinker behind all this. He talked about the idea of a failure of nerve. That he says the big challenge, the big temptation for leaders is to have what he calls a failure of nerve. And a failure of nerve happens when you are leading with a sense of conviction. You're not being bullheaded and you're not trying to be, controlling. But like, if the Spirit of God has called you to move the people out of slavery into the promised land, like if you are called to take people into the mission of God, what happens is in that process, that very process that God has called us to, empowered by the Spirit, the people will resist. They will even sabotage, is the word he uses. They will sabotage. It's 6 weeks after the parting of the Red Sea, 6 weeks after they're saying, I didn't realize we were camping. like, oh my gosh, the food has been scarce. They killed our children. I get it, but at least we had leeks and onions. Maybe we should go back, right? And the failure of nerve is the temptation for leaders to want to collude with the resistance of our people to stay in the status quo. That's the failure of nerve. You need to actually stand clearly for what God has told you to do and to take people forward. What I discovered when I was studying this and I was thinking about my own life is that I've been able to withstand that. I just happen to have a personality that can do okay with that. I joke that I'm an Enneagram 8 and I don't have to kick down every door, just the ones that are closed. And so I was the captain of the wrestling team. I'm like ready to go. My problem is it's Moses in Numbers 11 when they complain again. And now they're complaining about the food, not because they're hungry, but because they're bored of the miracle that happens every morning. Oh, manna again. Remember the leeks and onions? And Moses gets mad. Moses gets so mad, he literally says to God, if you're going to leave me with these people, you can kill me now. And I've never said you can kill me now, but I've often said, God, I could sell real estate. I could do life. Actually, what I often say is I could do trail maintenance. I'll go work for the National Park Service and I will do trail maintenance. That's what I will do. That'll be awesome, right? No people, just, me walking through the garden alone. It'll be awesome, right? That's what I call a failure of heart. It's when we become cynical, disconnected, angry. We are disconnected from our people. It's what my friend Jim Miato, who's the president of Compassion International, he once said to me, Todd, the great danger of doing the work of God is it can undo God's work in you. And so part of what we have to pay attention to is when we are having resistance of our people, either sabotage or whatever, we have a temptation to either failure of nerve or failure of heart. And then we can overcome both of those by developing what I call temporal resilience.
One of the things that I notice when things get really difficult, sometimes you look at it as a failure of your leadership. At other times, it becomes blaming the congregation because we're not moving forward.
Yeah.
What does this have to do with heart and nerve?
Yeah. So for me, one of the parts of it paying attention to is that I am called by God as a pastor. I am called by God to bring this people to where God wants us to go. So my definition of leadership is energizing a community of people toward their own transformation so that they can participate in God's mission in the world, right? So the thing that God has called us to do is going to require us to be transformed. It's just, that's what it means to live by the Spirit, where we can't do this of our own flesh. So because God's mission is calling us to make an impact and a witness for Christ in the world, it's going to require our transformation, which means that we are always in the process of saying yes to God and connecting to these people and together moving forward with a people who will resist. I mean, Ronald Heifetz says, leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. and I think for many of us, this is really sobering because we didn't get into ministry thinking we would be disappointing people. We got into ministry thinking we love God and we love people and we want to introduce the people we love to the God we love. And we'll get to do it by teaching them the scriptures we love. Isn't it great? And we don't realize that what we're actually doing is taking the people we love to the God we love, to do the mission of God to the world that God so loves, and we're not sure we do. And it's going to require us to be transformed.
Kim, do we have any other questions? I want to make sure that we get dialogue from folks who are with us.
Well, actually, I have a question. I love the section in the book about heeding.
Yeah.
The vulnerable self-reflection. That's, how do we make time for that?
Yeah.
One of the things in using the forge metaphor is that heeding takes place at different times during the process. So I'm assuming that self-reflection would have to.
Yeah.
You say more about that.
Yeah. So the way to think about this is the very experience of leading, especially leading adaptive change, right? So it's leading when you're not the expert. It's leading the learning. It's leading the loss. It's leading through experimentation and listening to voices you haven't learned. And it's leading through discernment. Like, this is what's important about us and essential, and we're taking it forward and we're adapting. This is a hard process. It's a vulnerable process. It's imperfect. And this is hard because, I work at a seminary. Everybody who came to seminary, somebody said to them, you're the best Christian I know. You should go pro. You should go off to professional Christian school. Right? And so they show up at professional Christian school, and we give them a degree, and they get a Master of Divinity. They sound like a superhero, right? And they go home and they start teaching the Bible, and people go, oh my gosh, you are amazing. And what happens is we are the experts. Let's face it, most of us are the expert at the scriptures or the Christian tradition, or even really important things like we're the place people come when somebody dies. They call us to the hospital. We walk people through the hardest moments of their lives. And then all of a sudden they look at us and they so appreciate us and respect us and trust us. And now we got to say, for the next thing we have to do to participate in God's mission in the world, we don't know what we're going to do. The world has changed. The things don't work the way they used to. We're going to have to learn. We're going to face loss. That vulnerability, that thing that it bubbles up at that moment, that temptation that you feel to fake it at that moment, that's 700 degrees.
Yeah.
And it's dangerous. Letting yourself go to 2000 degrees, which means that every single time we hit a crisis, every time we hit a new challenge, every time that the world has changed and we're not sure what to do, whenever we recognize that everything within us wants to go back, where we can be an expert, and instead we lean into the learning and the loss, then we are having to face, that's the heat coming. My dad used to always like to quote Harry Truman, if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen.
Right.
I always say, in leadership, the kitchen isn't hot enough. You got to actually get in the forge. And that's the forge of self-reflection. You got to actually let yourself feel the vulnerability of that moment. And that's the way that moves us forward.
Right. Powerful.
Well, Todd, go ahead, Kim. Thanks.
Just one more question. How can we tell when we've reached the danger area beyond moderate stress?
Yeah. So here's the way to think about this. At least it's different for different people. For me, it's when I get brittle. It's when I know that I am getting so wound, so tight that I'm afraid that one more thing is going to come and it's going to blow me up. Like I know that I need to have this, like I have this section in the book where I talk about the difference between airport Todd and Idaho Todd. Airport Todd is really good at getting on planes and traveling and being really, really focused. And then when I get to where our little place in the mountains in Idaho, which is in Idaho, the next thing I know is I am lingering and I'm talking and I'm chatting and I'm not an LA guy at all. And I need this rhythm in my life. And so for me, I know I'm getting beyond moderate stress when I start getting brittle. And that's what I've got to pay attention to.
Thank you.
Well, Todd, we just have a minute or two left. Are there any other aspects of this that we didn't cover that you would like to talk a little bit about as we close?
Yeah. So one of the most interesting discoveries in the work on tempered resilience was in almost all the literature. What I did is I studied both leadership development literature on change and I studied spiritual formation, and I pulled them together. And here's a really interesting part. There's this great irony. You'll hear all these paradoxes, right? You need vulnerability to get strong. You need people in your life to be able to make hard decisions that disappoint people. Well, here's one of the big ones. In order to change, and to be successful at leading change, you need to be grounded in something other than your success in leading change. The most brittle people are the people who need to turn the church around, who need to be successful, who need to demonstrate, who need to save the place. So you actually need to be grounded in something other than your success in leading change. And really, we see this in the life of Jesus, right? So before Jesus preached a sermon, did a miracle, confronted a power, cast out a demon, changed water into wine, the first thing happened was that he heard a voice who said, "In you I am well pleased." Pleased before he had done anything that demonstrated that he was the Messiah. And if I have any hope and wish for my clients, for people I talk to, for who I'm with, it's that somehow in the middle of this place, you would know first and foremost that you are grounded in the love of God that grounds you and holds you, and that you are already loved, and that is actually, that's your superpower. Your superpower is that you actually don't need to be successful at leading change. That's one of the things that's going to help you be able to do so. And And that's a bunch of the work we do. And if I can just say, if folks are interested in hearing more about the work we do, here's a really simple little way. I didn't make this up. I got staff who did this. You can text the word change. I feel embarrassed every time I say this. You can text change to 66866. Change 66866. We give you a bunch of slides from presentations I've done, resources that are free. You can hear about our newsletter and stuff. Text the word change to 66866. One of my staff set it up for me, and they make me say it every time I'm on a webinar. So,
well, that's great to offer the gifts of those resources. That is really beautiful. Thank you for that. And I was really moved by what you just said. If we can understand how deeply we're loved from God, we're coming from a very different space than the space where we really need everybody's approval.
yeah.
So I appreciated that so much. And I want to say thanks to everybody who was on with us tonight. Thank you for being a leader who is a lifelong learner, a leader who's willing to be shaped by the Spirit, a leader who takes the time away from work to be with colleagues to grow. It means so much. And Todd, we thank God for you and you're willing to be a part of that beauty for us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Kevin, Kim, I hope our paths will cross many times.
Me too. Me too. And as a fly fisher, we'll have to get that time away from work to do a little fly fishing together. I read that.
Sign me up. Sign me up. Yeah.
Well, good night, everybody. Thank you so much. It's been a really good time together, and I hope you have a wonderful evening and that this can help you in your leadership, both center you and help you be more fruitful in a way that is beautiful and centered in Christ. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.